Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to have our guest speaker. I'm going to read from the poster announcing this event in conjunction with the Jay and Janine Schottenstein Honors Program. So the title of this presentation is A Design Proposal for the Kesher Synagogue in Englewood, New Jersey. I'm going to read verbatim just for one or two sentences. Esther Sperber has been writing and lecturing on architecture and psychoanalysis, two fields of praxis that strive to reduce human distress and widen the range of human experience. Born and raised in Jerusalem, she studied architecture at the Technion in Haifa and Columbia University in New York. So please help me welcome Esther Sperber.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to tell you, I think, a little bit of a story about a project we designed that is not being built, and kind of tell you the unfolding of the whole process from the beginning until where it ended, and then maybe I can fill you in a little bit, if you want, on what happened next. And this is more of a conversation, so feel free to interrupt and ask questions, and if something doesn't make sense, I'm happy to talk about it. So the Kesher community is a synagogue just on the border between Englewood and Tenafly. And they had two sites, two residential buildings. One is this blue house where the shul used to meet. Oh, no? Oops, you don't see anything? Oh, there it is. Great. And another one that you can see next to it, which is this White House. And they decided that these two buildings don't work for them, and they were going to have invited competition with a few architects and solicit ideas for how to deal with this. As competitions often are, they actually were really fair, and they paid us a little bit to do this project, but it was a very crammed time. We had like 3 weeks, and we had to basically solve this complicated program. We got a kind of RFP from them stating some things about their community. So they talked about the fact that they saw it as a very warm and community-based shul. They really wanted people to feel very comfortable there. They talked about the fact that right now, because they didn't have enough space, many times they did kiddush outside in the backyard of the White House, and they really wanted to continue that. They wanted to have a very strong connection between the inside and the outside, and as much as possible have kind of a flow between the different spaces. And then another thing that they mentioned, which was a little unusual, was a value that I think came from the rabbi at the time, Rabbi Jeff Fox, who really wanted the space to be universally accessible, meaning that you would be able to go to any space in the shul without using the elevator, even if there would be a Shabbat elevator, and that you would be able to comfortably go to every indoor, outdoor, roof, terrace space, even if you were in a wheelchair, or also thinking a lot about the very young children that they have and people with strollers, and as well as elderly people. So that was quite a challenge. Adding to that, they also wanted to design a building that potentially could allow the existing house, this blue house that people were kind of attached to emotionally, even though it really didn't work for a shul. They thought they might want to keep it. So they wanted to design something that potentially could allow the shul to remain either during construction or for long term. And so I'll just show you a little bit of the site, and then I'll show you our competition entry. So this is the blue house. There are two main streets, one here and then a smaller street on the side. This is the back of the shul. They had to add this extra fire stair. You can see it's, not in great shape. And this is the side house that one they were clear that they were going to demolish. This is a view from the street looking down the White House, and then the blue house is further down. And so we started looking at the site initially and just doing many, I mean, this is only a small selection of the many massing models that we worked with, trying to get some kind of form that would wrap around the existing building, that would have a focal point that would be the sanctuary, which you can see in many of these different models. So this was schemes that looked like different, we thought of it as a little town, so maybe more like an urban plan with the main sanctuary, the daily chapel, the social hall, and then the other spaces. These were more ramped kind of ideas where from the front yard you could ramp up to the roof, the sanctuary, and the daily chapel. This was another almost like a parking garage kind of folded space, and a whole bunch of other ones. And we played with these for quite a while and came to this entry, which is what we submitted and which won this competition. The idea being that the site was very small. We were going to create a building that was all landscape, and every space would be accessible to these roofs. So this is the main social hall. It's a big space with less views. It opens out to the front yard. You could ramp up to these other roofs. This connected to the offices and classrooms. This was the main sanctuary, which was kind of like a diamond piece inserted into this. The daily chapel was here in the front, and the connections around it. You can also see one of the views from this roof, so very kind of subdued, and this would be the entrance. Another thing we spoke about when we made this proposal was that the community intended, yeah, sorry.
What computer program do you use to design these renderings?
So we play with a lot of computer programs. This was actually very quick, and you'll see later some nicer renderings. These were in 3D Max. We mostly use a program called Rhino, which is very good for modeling, and then different softwares for rendering. Another kind of piece of this proposal was that the community around the shoal, the wider community, not the membership of the shoal, were a little less excited about building another big shoal there. There was a long fight over getting the eruv there, and they didn't want to upset the township, so trying to get a building that was kind of folded into the landscape was very appealing to them in terms of making the statement to the neighbors that they weren't going to take over. And, this was our floor plan. This was the entrance. The idea was that because this was a space that was very multi-purpose, there would be many spaces that were kind of, it would be like a big shed, and inside it would be the various pieces that are more enclosed. So this was the main sanctuary. It could be connected when there was a simcha to this daily chapel, so this would all become one big room. This was the social hall. Instead of being an actual room, it kind of utilized the lobby with a kitchen inside. This was the cutout in the ramp that was the place for the sukkah. These were various back of house things, offices, and then upstairs there were the kids group room. And then this was a very preliminary sketch for the sanctuary. It was basically like you saw, that kind of diamond shape. So we placed windows. We took a cube, and then we kind of focused specific views that we thought might be nice. It's a suburban area, so view to the sky is beautiful. A view to the top of the trees is beautiful. Some of the views lower down are a little messier. So we tried to create a space that was very simple, and then with these openings, we kind of pulled out the walls, so they're like trapezoids going towards the windows. So we got very nice, excited responses from the community, but then they said, phase 2, we sign a contract, you start doing the design. We want this to look a little more like a building. And they also had some comments about the plan and the layout and how the flow worked. And so then we got to spend quite a few months, I would say maybe 6 or 8 months on the next phase of design, really working out how this building could work. And so I'll show you first the floor plans, because I I kind of like the way they developed. So as you see, the forms got a little bit more rounded. And rather than having that big shed where the different programs were kind of placed inside this roof, each space had a little more of their own identity. So the Daily Chapel moved here to the front, being the most accessible, the one that everyday people would be coming to. They don't have to open the whole building necessarily. The parking, which was an important piece of it, was going to be kind of this loop, L-shaped loop around, so you'd enter on the side street and come back out on the main street. And the plan was to kind of pitch to the township that since people don't drive on Shabbat, although some people come on Friday and leave their car and take it home after on Motzei Shabbat, but the idea was that part of that would be the play space for the kids. So this back road was envisioned as kind of partly landscape, partly parking, but we had to get the number of cars that they required. So you could come in from here, you'd ramp up. This was the main lobby. Then you could come to the Daily Chapel, Rabbi's office, coat room. And the main floor plan now became something like a suburban split-level house. So if you know how those work, you go in the middle. Then you can go up half a floor, usually to the bedrooms, and down half a floor to the living room, dining room. So in this case, you come in at this level. You can go up half a floor to the sanctuary. Or if you go down half a floor, you get to the social hall. What's nice about that is that then because you go up half, you go down half, you can connect directly under the upper level. So this really allowed us to achieve what the rabbi wanted, which was these ramps that take up a lot of room when you do them ADA compliant, that would allow people to go to every space without using the stairs. So the main stair would come up to this sanctuary foyer. From here you go into the shul itself. The nice thing about this very difficult site, this is the old building here, was that it ended up giving us this L-shaped sanctuary, which initially we thought was not ideal, but in the end turned out very nice because they were going to do men and women on different sides and have a very small mechitza here, which was something that they wanted. They wanted it to feel very equal and like everyone is in the same space. So you go up half a level, you can look down back onto the lobby, and this is the ramp that goes up. So you can see how the distance you need for a stair and the distance you need for a ramp of this going up the same height. From here, you could go down another ramp into the social hall, which opened up directly into this terrace that was the Sukkah terrace and back to the front yard. If you go down this ramp into the social hall, you're under the sanctuary, and that connects to some of the service stuff and then all these youth classrooms that open up to the outside, kind of a youth lounge, and then lower level of mechanical. So this is a rendering from the front street. You can see the blue house in white and the building wrapping around it with a kind of exterior landscaping. So this is a Daily Chapel that I mentioned. This would be the front entrance. Wrapping around the other side is the social hall. And here's the same rendering, the same view if they decide to take away the existing building. And you can see that that would really give them a nice courtyard that would be very usable. This is an aerial view. You again can see it with the chapel. You can see here, can you see the mouse? Yeah. Here you can see the ramp that goes up behind the Daily Chapel and connects to the upper level of the sanctuary. This was one of our outdoor spaces. And here there was another green roof, I'll get you in a minute, that goes also right out of the chapel upper level. Yes?
Why would they decide to keep that very Victorian house when you have like such a modern contrast? I mean, I don't see a reason. Is there like a sentimental?
It was mostly, so they did a survey of the membership, and there was almost half and half. 50% of the people really felt very strong connection to this building, mostly sentimental. It's very dysfunctional for a shul. Because it was a house, has a very, very steep stair with, bad carpet on it. And the other half of the community felt that this was just a money pit, and every time they touched something, something else broke, and you had to replace the windows and the roof. And ultimately, the strange thing that happened is that even though it doesn't really have a very, significance in terms of its architectural style, it seemed to have gained importance not just for the Shoals, in the Shoals mind, but also in the township. And the town did want them to keep it. So I think they are building a new building, which basically has the same exact layout, but kind of different finishes, similar to this plan. So, I think, who knows, maybe in the future they'll take it down because it doesn't make much sense, but that's kind of where it was. So here you can see the aerial view, and obviously this big space here is that L-shaped sanctuary. The second big space is the social hall, and the third pronounced space is the daily chapel. So those are kind of the three main spaces. This is a view from the back. I mentioned the parking road that we were going to try to do a mix of pavers with a lot of grass growing in between them. The classrooms are here opening out, and this is one of the terraces that ramps down to the front yard off the sanctuary. I forgot to mention that kind of one of our pitching slogans, or one of the things we used in our initial pitch, was that since the name of the community was Kesher, we really kind of thought that was a meaningful thing, the kind of link between something that's connected and something that's an actual knot. And so you can see this plan layout almost like a one strip that's knotted, that's all connected. This is a view of this is the front door, and this is the daily chapel, and this would be the lobby. This is a little sketch of the lobby. One of the things we tried to emphasize was also that if you kind of get the right hierarchy of spaces and the windows looking in the right directions and a good layout and a good circulation, it wouldn't be necessary to use very expensive materials in order to get a sense of a nice space. So for the lobby itself, we were showing a concrete floor and a very simple ceiling, with the idea that the views from the courtyard and the grass and then the ramp up to the sanctuary would give the space enough of a special feel. And then this, I think, was our nicest view, which is the view of the sanctuary. Sorry?
Which one?
This is the Shabbos Minyan, the big sanctuary. So this is the L-shaped space. This would be the women, that would be the men. One thing I didn't talk about in terms of the articulation of this building is that we decided to work with this cladding that was kind of like these warped ribs, where we could actually define how much they are open and how much they are closed. Not that they would be movable, but that in the design we would create these different kinds of ribs so that we would allow views in certain directions and let the daylight in from the directions we want and be more closed directions we don't want. And that really allowed us so these are those skylights that you saw in the sanctuary space. And so these are those ribs, we developed some of the details for it, but it was going to be a prefabricated skin that would be put on top of the building and would incorporate these glass skylights. Because the sanctuary was half a floor above the entrance, but a full floor above the back road because of the way the topography was, it would be looking straight into the treetops rather than at the neighboring, there's a kind of brick, not very nice brick building right there. One of the funny things that happened was the initial rendering, we didn't do the mechitza because it kind of blocks the view of the other side, and I thought it was more clear to see the architecture without it. And the only thing people talked about in the presentation was how high was the mechitza going to be? Was it going to be solid? Was it going to be glass? Was it going to be a curtain? How can we do this without a mechitza? So we stuck something in as a placeholder, and we kept saying, we're not yet designing the mechitza, we're designing the whole building. But it was interesting that was a very emotional thing for most people there. Then, talking about, so this was early 2000, we did most of these plans, or late 2000, and then the economy crashed, and they kind of freaked out a little bit. And then we did a little exercise for a few months working with a bunch of engineers and fabricators that could do this exterior to try to figure out a simpler way to do the outside, and then a whole other set of cost savings that we worked with a cost estimator to come up with. They were thinking maybe the lower level with the classrooms would just be built as a shell and not finished in the first phase. There was a thought that maybe they wouldn't build the daily chapel for the first phase. So each of these pieces we worked with a kind of figuring out how it could be designed to be added or taken off if they needed to, if the budget wasn't enough. And so one of the iterations was this, where we kind of proposed using the really simple metal cladding that you see on Home Depots in the suburbs, or often there are these green roofs. They're metal, they're folded metal sheets. The sheet itself is not very thick, but because of the fold at the end and then they interlock, they get some kind of rigidity. They're not expensive and they're very standard. And what we were suggesting, which of course the metal companies thought we were crazy when we talked to them, was instead of taking one of their colors, playing with a bunch of shades of kind of gold to silver. And then, as you can see, instead of the ribs and the very complicated exterior facade, these just have simple slot windows. And then we were hoping that at least in the sanctuary, as you can see at the top of the image, that we would be able to keep a more unique skylight, because if you're going to put money in one place, it should be in the main sanctuary. So I actually really like this view. It's a lot kind of simpler. The geometry is, the angular ends of the building, and I think it still kind of has a certain dignity of a public building without being ostentatious. So you can see this bottom turned from wood into concrete, and then the exterior turned into this metal, these metal ribs.
Keep being the same color all around the walls?
It's a big building compared to most suburban houses. If you could do everything in gray or everything in brown,
The original one was white, wasn't it?
No, the original one was white, but here, if I go back to it, it had a lot of articulation because of all these windows and the curvatures of the material. My concern was that if we did all of this in one color, it would look very big and heavy. It would really look a bit like a block, like a big Home Depot type store, even though the geometry isn't like that. But that somehow mixing the colors would give it a little more softness and a little bit more blending in with the landscape, and hopefully with the many trees that we could keep. But yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I wonder what it would look like if it were all white. It would be worth kind of looking at. So that's, again, the view from the back. And this is just a slide with some other projects that we've done in our office. I thought it might be of interest. So my office is a small firm. We have 3 people working aside from me, and we do a mix of a lot of residential projects, mostly apartment renovations, some of them very high-end. And then probably about a third of our work is these more low-budget institutional projects. One of our projects that I really like is this image, and this down here was a renovation of the 14th Street Y, which is on 14th and 1st Avenue, and was a very fun gut renovation of their ground floor. And then ever since, we've been doing other projects for them. We redid the basketball court, indoor basketball court, the theater, the daycare. And in that case, it was also, again, a very deliberate and complicated task of finding a way to do something that was colorful and exciting and gave a sense of community without using expensive materials. They had a very tiny budget for New York. So you can see, like in this image of the locker room, we basically used generic, like New York Sports Club type of lockers, but we played with the colors. And the lobby, similarly, we used that funky yellow furniture with the blue floor. This was an exhibit we did at the Jewish Museum that was a 2-week artist residency program they did. So the artists worked in the gallery and exhibited their work. And we created the spaces for them to work. So this is a big wall from cardboard. This was, you can hardly see. This was a desk where the artist worked, and these were screens that showed his old projects, and this was a viewing place, and he projected on the wall across. And then these are some of the residential projects. This is the Fort Tryon Jewish Center Synagogue right here in Washington Heights that we've been working with for a while, conservative Joel. Yeah. So, and then I did bring a few slides, I don't know if you want, of two other synagogue projects. That one is very, very conceptual and very kind of initial design, and the other one is the Fort Tryon Jewish Center, which we've worked on a little more. This was a shul in Israel, so I'm originally from Israel, and a friend of mine was the rabbi of this shul in Kfar Saba, and they wanted us to design a building for them. They had a site, and we did just the very conceptual design. The idea was to use the kind of forms that come from Hebrew letters as the form to generate the shul design. And the idea was that just as kind of the letters have thicker parts and thinner parts, we would create an exterior wall that was like that. So the thick part could house the Aron Kodesh or have a bookshelf for the Sidurim, and the thinner parts would be more typical walls. And this was kind of a study we were doing about kind of how we could deform this lamed. And we ended up with this plan, which worked really nicely on the site. I'll show you just quickly wow, this was a long time ago. This is the front entrance. There's a little yard with a tree. This was a shul for another Sephardi minyan that we were just going to give them that rectangle. They asked for that. Then there was a ramp going down to a lower garden. This was the main entrance to the shul. This was the main Izlat Gvarim, the women's section with the little extra space when when it's an event. Second floor was just going to be 2 small classrooms that could be used as overflow space looking down into the main sanctuary. And if you took the stair down or the ramp through the courtyard, there was a garden and a small social hall for kiddush, etc. And a beit midrash under this form. So this was the Aron Kodesh here. This was the fat wall for the Sidurim. The Fort Tryon Jewish Center is kind of an interesting story. We won't go into the whole long story, but basically they did a deal with the developer. He did some demolition on their building and then defaulted on his loans, and so the building is still unusable. But while they were still working with the developer, and we've ever since been working with them now, starting up again, they felt that he cared about the condo he was building in the back and not really about what they would get in the shul. So they asked us to come and help them with the interiors of the shul. And so they had a few things that concerned them. This is the view of the existing shul. It's actually quite a nice space, but it's really kind of its time. So it seats 400 people. They usually don't need more than 100 or maybe max 200. So it's much too big. It's very frontal. It's kind of from the time where the chazan and the rabbi and everyone stood way up front, and they really wanted a sense that this space would be more of a communal space, more intimate. People would feel more connected. And so they wanted to also move some of the action to the middle. And it also just felt a bit dark and tired. So our first kind of inspiration was this Gemara page where the idea would be to create kind of a focal point in the middle and then wrap around it more and more layers so that when they have a smaller group, they can cut part of the space off and still have a sense of intimacy. So if you look at the floor plan, this is the Aron Kodesh, and we're going to move the bima further into the middle and create a big skylight around it. That's kind of the main focal point. And most people would sit around here. And then there would be a kind of a secondary level further out, and especially in the back, that would be blocked off at times that they don't need it. So these were some of the renderings we did for what it would look like with this new skylight and this kind of series of ceiling levels that would move the focus from the front to the center. And then if you see here, they were going to build a balcony up on the second level that would be not really a balcony, but build out some space and add 2 classrooms over there. And from this level, there would be, at the time we were thinking there would be probably like powered, more like curtains that would come down and block off that part. I might have a rendering with it, although I'm not sure. No. And this is another view looking up to the front again, towards Aron Kodesh, and keeping the stained glass that they have. The other space that needed a lot of help was their social hall. Also very dated, lots of smoky mirrors and wallpaper. And again, we were working with trying to just keep the views, but create a design that would feel new and clean and much more intimate. And this last slide is basically a cross section that maybe actually can explain pretty well. So this is the front entrance. There would be a lobby that would have a little articulation. This is where someone would greet you, or maybe the security person. These are the classrooms that were going to be extended on the second floor. So from here would drop down the partition that would close off part of the shul. And then here you can see this series of ceilings going up with the light coves around them to the skylight. And this would be the most central part, and then this is the social hall. The whole building is sitting on these, it's on a huge topography from Fort Washington to Overlook. So it's sitting on these big steel columns, and this was the Beit Midrash up on the second floor that was also going to be renovated. So I think now, hopefully we have a little bit of time for people to ask questions or...
So then can we just slowly go through
Sure.
what you've just shown us? Can we go to the next slide, please?
That one?
So anybody in Architectural Design 1, a veteran of that course, or in Architectural Design 2, the expression of the lamed on the left is what we in class call a parti sketch. So for anyone who had trouble understanding what was expected or what we were thinking of, that's a marvelous example of how an idea is expressed in a sketch or in a series of sketches, and then how that idea is woven into the actual design. I do have a question about this.
Sure.
It's a really interesting design, and it's a larger question about the design process and design method. We do a little exercise like this in the first sequence of the design class, and many of the students have difficulty, as I did myself when I was a student, expressing an appropriate hierarchy between the main space, which is so clearly expressed here, and the secondary, more utilitarian spaces such as storage, restrooms, kitchen. So how do you respond to that as a practitioner? They're hardly even visible in this model.
Right.
Do you always express them at a different level, or what advice would you have to us as beginners as a way to think about the differentiation between the importance of those spaces?
That's a wonderful question, because I think that's something that we all struggle with at every level of experience and at every point, I think, in our professional life. I'm just now working on something that we're doing for a kind of unbuilt competition, and I think one thing that's important is really to try to articulate to yourself what is the what is your main idea? Obviously, in any design charrette that you're doing in the studio or in a competition, or even for the first presentation to the client, it can't all be worked out. You have to be smart. I mean, you need fire stairs, you need some back of house spaces. But what's really important is, I think, not to get caught up too much in figuring out all the details of that. That can happen later on. What really has to stand out is what you're trying to say as an idea. And I think actually this wood model is a really good a good example of that, because this Sephardi shul that was here, we didn't design it. We were supposed to give it that amount of space, and so we just blocked it out. And this was the stair, and this is the elevator and the bathroom. So rather than try to build every part of it in the model, which would just kind of clutter it and maybe obscure the actual concept, this isn't a realistic model, it's a concept model. So the idea was really to show the concept. And part of the concept is that there are some massive parts that to use the idea of a letter, you need something that's solid. And those back of house things are more those solid things. So I don't know if that's helpful. I'm trying to think if there's a good example. I think if you look here, obviously there's a lot that could be figured out, but the things that are, some of these spaces, they're really just laying out what could be there. I mean, does it matter if the rabbi's office is this or that? No. But what is important is to see kind of these lines that are continuing, and then, so really that's the part that we try to articulate and figure out how these different spaces would connect in section. And I think, you could do the same thing with corners that are angular, and perhaps in reality that's what would happen, because it might be too expensive to do all these curved walls. But I think at this point in the design, it was really important to show that, because that's really part of the main idea. Does that help?
Yes, very much. Any questions from the audience before I begin with my series of questions? Anybody? Any of the?
Yeah. You got the picture of the lamed.
Yeah.
One, I didn't see the lamed, and more so, assuming it was able to be seen from the aerial view, somebody in the shul, would he actually be able to notice that he's inside of the letter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think you wouldn't necessarily, it wasn't important to us that it was a lamed or a nun or a kaf. The idea was more, there isn't exactly, I mean, you've learned a lot about this now in your class, but there isn't a set typology for synagogues the way they have them for churches or even mosques. So we have a little bit of leverage to play, and the words are kind of the central part of our culture. So the idea was to use that. And I think, you have to kind of believe, I would say that architecture, it's a strange thing, because you're drawing something in plan in 2 dimensions, right? And you have to kind of believe that you'll actually feel that shape of a space, that's going to translate into a certain kind of experience in the building. I don't know if you would know exactly that this was a letter, but I think you would definitely feel the difference between coming in, slipping in a glass wall between this massive, let's say, concrete curvy wall, versus if we just did, a square building.
Obvious.
I think you would
But
feel
have you
that
seen
kind
it?
of wrapping part.
Is the goal to recognize that it's supposed to resemble a certain shape?
In this case, no. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be a particular letter. It was supposed to have that sense of like a form that is both, that wraps you and has this difference of thickness. And I think we actually had some views. I'm sorry I didn't bring those slides. We had a few views from far away, and I think you would have actually kind of sensed the shape of it. Another thing we were playing with, which was part of this image, was the idea that we might perforate the wall with these letters, or with some kind of letters, or with some kind of text. We kind of got a little bit stuck on, should you read the letters from the inside or from the outside? But the idea being that, during the day the light would come in through these letters, and during the night you would walk, outside, I don't know, when you leave shul after Shabbat, and you'd see this glow through the letters, which I think would be very beautiful.
Other questions?
Yeah,
I have a question on the last slide, the cross section.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
How
How
do you do that?
Yeah.
So we had it. So there's all kinds of tricks. So sometimes, and that's actually interesting in terms of like looking at this rendering and that cross section. Sometimes these cross section type models are not the same model that we use to render for the synagogue, for the Kesher synagogue. The rendering for the interior of the sanctuary is the same model, same 3D model that we used for the outside. But here, this was actually a different model because there wasn't enough, it wasn't that hard to just recreate it. So it's basically, you make a 3D model in the computer of the spaces, and then there are options in the program to slice it or to kind of put an invisible plane and see only what's in front. And then we actually did, some of this is in Photoshop. So sometimes, you have to add, I think at one of them we actually had to stain glass on it, one of the iterations. But these are definitely modeled in there. You see, these are the chairs from the other synagogue. So it's a mix of rendering and Photoshop.
I can't resist telling you a little bit more about this, and Ms. Sperber knows more about it than I, but just about this story, there's the term Faustian deal, which is you may have heard of Cliche making a deal with the devil, and that's the metaphor for what the congregation did. I think the ideas here are just wonderful, and I had no idea, did not know that they'd actually commissioned you to develop what they had.
Yeah.
So the left side is the side off of Fort Washington Avenue. It's the earlier part of the building. It was designed around 1956. And then I think around 1960 perhaps, the sanctuary was built. It was extended in the back. When you take the shuttle to the A train, you see the stilts, the piloti that are illustrated there in the slide. It's actually right next to the subway station at 184th Street and Overlook Terrace. The deal was that in exchange for a certain considerable amount of cash paid by the developer, who, by the way, had no experience developing the condominium project of that scale and scope, and that was part of the problem. The congregation would give essentially.
Yeah, I can show it in the plan actually.
Egress, not egress, but.
And the easement. So if you look at this floor plan, this is currently the facade of the shul, this whole width.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going to sell the developer half of their lobby, which made their lobby super narrow. And he was going to then put an elevator here and another bridge that went, actually most of the building he was doing was not on their property. It was on property he owned. He bought a tiny little piece from them. But this was his main, selling point, because apparently it's better to have an address on Fort Washington.
With the Fort Washington address,
is better.
the children
Can go to the
PS
school.
187. So it's very simple.
Yeah.
The Fort Washington address was in the district that was served by
A better school.
a better regarded public school, which was so well regarded that the parents convinced the school board to add 2 grades. So it's actually very unusual for New York City public schools to have K through 8 in one school. And so that was the motivation for this rather complex deal. Esther, what above that? What is the lattice work in the upper drawing? Is that just
This?
the lower right of the
Lattice work.
drawing?
Sorry.
Just above, in the center, above that, not that. Yeah, of the section of that. Is that?
The diamonds.
Oh, I don't know why it looks like that. No, these are where those columns are, and then I think maybe they were going to do cross bracings there.
Okay.
They actually also had some plan to park cars in this
Okay.
structure somehow.
All right.
I discovered that in one of the iterations of the plan. So what they did was they demolished one of the shul's fire stairs, which was here where the elevator is, and they put the elevator in, and then they demoed this, and they demoed the 2 upper floors, and now it's been probably 6 years that it's been empty.
A long time, yeah.
Yeah.
So just a few more questions. Does anybody else have questions? I have a few. Ari, anybody? No? Some of these are more general. To get back to Kesha,
Yeah.
what was the method or the process by which the client expressed the congregational wishes? Was there a committee that you were asked to work with, or was there a sole representative who was the spokesperson for the committee? How did that work?
That's a great
Was it
question.
mostly the rabbi, because there is a
Yeah.
figure who's
So
central to the community?
initially, for the competition, they actually wrote a document, which I think they also found that process quite helpful, where they tried to articulate what they needed in terms of the program. They actually put together a pretty good program of, we need 5 classrooms of 500 square feet in the sanctuary that can seat 250 people on a Shabbat and 400 when there's a bar mitzvah or something like that. And they wrote something about their aspirations, which I think was drafted by a building committee and the rabbi. Later on after the competition ended, they actually formed a new building committee because I think they saw this as being a real project, and they needed people that were not just the people who were willing to volunteer, but some people who had more financial background, some people that were donors, some people that had experience in construction. So they had quite a good team of people. The rabbi was never part of that process, and I think he gave his feedback to the committee, but and I'm not sure if he was at the presentations. I don't think he came to that. One of the interesting things that I have found is, I've now worked with quite a few synagogues, and almost all of them are unbuilt. So it is a bit of a complicated client, because as opposed to, let's say, the 14th Street Y, where there's a clear executive director and then an assistant whose job is to get things done, and then a few committees that come to just share their opinions. And the 14th Street Y was very welcoming had many people part of the process, but it was very clear that when we went to look at the yellow chairs for the lobby, everyone was kind of like, maybe, I don't know. And then they looked at the executive director and he said, Esther, do you think this will be good? And I said, yes. And he said, okay. Shuls have a little bit less clear hierarchy. The rabbi is somebody hired. The executive director, if there is one, is often also somebody hired, not necessarily from the community. So not necessarily seen as a leader in anything other than the financial aspects of the building. And the committees are something pretty fluid. I mean, there's a board elected, and then a new board elected, and a new chair of the board. And so part of what happened is our project was put on hold for quite a while. They didn't do anything. And then by the time they decided to start, the rabbi was no longer there. There was a new team of people. And if you Google it, you'll see the plans are very similar. I mean, and the elevations look very similar to what we did. It's not like a copyright issue. I mean, we were paid for everything we did, and they were completely honorable. But, there was a new system, and, someone else, selected another architect to finish the project. I think they wanted someone more local, someone that they felt would be able to better keep the budget down. I think that was a big concern.
It's funny, that sounds like that's a Bergen County saga, because there was a synagogue in Englewood, Temple Emmanuel, that sold its circular building, cylindrical building, to a Korean church and relocated to Closter. And they hired Robert A.M. Stern to design the building for them, and exactly the same thing happened. And there was this kind of lull period, this intermediary period when they did fundraising or made some decisions, and in the process he distanced himself from the job. So the building is very much what he designed, but he said, my name can't be on that because I really did not supervise that.
Interesting. I mean, I still think there's something really magical about trying to create a space for prayer. There are many kinds of buildings that are very moving, and there are other buildings that can be moving but can be just fine. Like, this classroom is fine, but it's hard to be inspired because you're sitting in here. So I used to work, when I started out, I came to New York, I went to Columbia, and then I worked for Pei Partnership Architects, which is I.M. Pei, a very famous architect, and his sons. And we did mostly museums, and museums also have that wonderful advantage where the program is kind of flexible enough that you can just make a Pei Partnership Architects. So that was wonderful, but I think shuls are kind of like that. I mean, the program is pretty simple. You need a room with chairs, and there's not much that you actually need. It's not a hospital. It's not a functionally complicated thing, but if you can make a space that gives you both a sense of community and a feeling of togetherness, and a space where you can feel actually kind of introspective and, closed into yourself in a good way and not distracted, and have some kind of kavanah, then that's a really beautiful thing to achieve. And so, despite the difficulty of the typology, I really enjoy those kind of projects.
Just a few more questions for me.
Of course.
I was very intrigued by the material of your original design for Keshner, that light colored material. You said it was some kind of cladding. Can you tell us more about what actual materials you envisioned for that?
Yeah, we talked to a lot of different companies. When you try to do something that's a bit outrageous, then you end up having to spend a lot of time, not necessarily paid for, to try to figure out how to do this, because you want to do something more interesting. So we ended up looking at these fiberglass reinforced concrete materials. They are very, very strong and very thin, and they can be cast in different kinds of forms. So the idea was to find, a certain number of repetitive forms, so you don't have to have, one form for each rib. That would be too expensive. But if we had a certain repetition, you could cast those ribs, and they could span that entire size and be attached to a subframe of some sort. So we got actually some, a bunch of samples. It was a very interesting thing to look at. They also have now these ceramic type cladding that also can be made with a fiberglass reinforcement that makes them strong enough to hold up.
And as you envisioned it, were they actually replicable, or were they the same dimension replicated in many cases, or was each one somehow, somewhat a variation on the dimension of the one preceding it? Because it looked as if there was some kind
They were fanning out.
Yeah.
So some of the corners, they were fanning out. Yeah, we did develop that cladding actually quite a lot. So the idea was that there were parts that were flat, and those, even if I go back to that, it would be more clear, I guess. So these curves could be a certain repetition of a dimension, wouldn't all be exactly the same. Then they would be connected to a flat part that would vary in size, but that's simple, relatively simple. And then these pieces were mostly repetitions on a certain angle. So we did come up with a kind of almost uniform. Again, here you can see some of these were very similar. Then these are a little bit different because the angle between the curved part and the flat part changes. But we came up with a reasonable number of variations that could be combined. So it's most like a kit of parts. So the flats were all repetitious, and then the curved would be a little bit different. And the other advantage of that is that the mold part for the curves was not very big. So, getting a mold that would be different for those pieces wasn't so hard, versus doing a whole panel that would be large. Yeah.
And I guess finally, was there any particular, since you've already said there really is no particular synagogue typology, but were there any antecedents that on some conscious or unconscious level you think might have inspired you with this very expressive form and the other very expressive forms that you designed? Because I see, in other words, when you mentioned in Fort Tryon this the layers with curtains. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it was a great reference, but Percival Goodman designed a synagogue in Providence, Rhode Island, Temple Bethel, which has that same, at least, solution to the way to expand and contract based on the size of the congregation. And I think of, because they don't design synagogues, but I think of the Dillon's Video and what they've done with the Broad Museum and other, cast elements that are replicated and have this, very organic quality that's very unique.
Yeah, I mean, I love their work, and I love some of the work of Herzog de Meuron. We're also very clever in how it's beautiful, but it's also a very smart way of kind of creating a transition within a certain number of repetitive parts. Spaces that inspired me, I don't know. I think I would actually love you to to tell me what this reminds you of, or other people here.
I would say the most awe-inspiring moment, shuls are like this big grandeur, like shuls that you see in Israel, which are reflecting those in Europe. They were just big and tall, and you walk in, and the ceilings are 50, 60 feet tall, and you go, whoa. I mean, nowadays it doesn't really work so much because that's a very old theme. But same thing that you see like in all the big train stations in Grand Central Station. The point is to be wowed by the grandeur size of it. So that's one way to do it.
Right. I mean, I think my hope was actually to create something that would feel kind of
So in here, it's really nice
precious,
to trees. It's really
right?
cool.
Precious and special and beautiful without being so grand. Because I think there's something. I think typically churches are definitely of that nature. I think that part of it's making you feel a little bit kind of the feeling of awe, which is a nice feeling, but I don't think, to me, that's not the main feeling when I go to shul. Awe, like kind of grandeur of the institution. And I think the church has that institution. It has the Pope and all that. We don't really have that.
Nice.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end by explaining how the feeling and the liturgical elements are somehow translated into form. So let's thank Esther Sperber again for the very inspiring talk.
Thank you all, and thank you, Paul.